Once the project activities have been defined and sequenced, the project manager needs to find out what resources will be needed to perform them. In addition, the project manager needs to know when those resources will be available. In this lesson, we'll look at the process that estimates what and when these resources will be available, the Estimate Activity Resources process. Resources in a project could mean people, software, hardware, equipment, materials, tools, supplies, machinery, or anything that will be needed in order to execute an activity. The purpose of the Estimate Activity Resources process is to figure out what type of resources and how much of each type of resource will it take to perform the project activity. This process focuses on each individual activity within the schedule to calculate its resource requirements. Although the Estimate Activity Resources process is part of the time management knowledge area, this process is normally done at the same time as the Estimate Cost process that we'll discuss later in the cost management knowledge area. The first input into the Estimate Activity Resources process is the Schedule Management Plan. This plan has the guidelines on how a project manager should estimate the resources needed for the project activities. It also identifies the units of measure that will be used and the level of accuracy those units will be based on. The activity lists and the activity attributes that were identified during the Define Activities process will give the project manager all the information needed to understand the tasks in an activity in order to estimate its needed resources. Resource calendars have information about availability, capability, and the skill set of resources during the life cycle of the project. Remember, resources aren't just things that the project will need, it also includes the people that it will need. The risk register identifies potential risks that have been documented during the planning stage, and these risks must be understood while estimating the resources for activities. Activity cost estimates include the cost of resources that may impact the resource selection. This is developed during the cost management process. Organizational process assets, like specific policies for acquiring resources from outside the company, and enterprise environmental factors such as existing resources in the organization, are critical inputs to this process. It's important to note that the project's human resources, their skill sets, as well as their availability are all factors that must be considered when estimating activity resources. The tools and techniques used during the Estimate Activity Resources process include expert judgment. A project manager shouldn't try to do all the work by themselves. There could be a special skill they may need, or even some advice on alternatives, and an expert can always help. Alternative analysis is a way of figuring out the different types of resources that can be used, then determining the right choice based on factors such as cost, time, and the quality associated with each of the resources. Many projects can use information based on standard resources used in their industry. This published estimating data is industry-specific information that's typically published in trade journals, websites, publications, or periodicals. Project managers can utilize this information to help accurately estimate the resources they can assign to activities, based on how it's done throughout the rest of the industry. Bottom-up estimating is a technique that allows the project manager to get a more refined estimate for the project work. In bottom-up estimating, each task is broken down into smaller components. Then, individual estimates for each task are developed. The estimates for these smaller tasks are then aggregated, or in other words, added up to develop a larger estimate for the entire task as a whole. When using bottom-up estimating, the estimate for the project work is far more accurate because instead of just making one large general estimate, it allows for a more careful consideration of each of the smaller parts of a task. Project management software, like Microsoft Project, can be useful to track how much of a resource is needed and the length of time the resources will be required in order to meet the project objectives. Remember, these software tools can't do all the work for the project manager. They're just a tool to help the project manager do their job. The outputs of the Estimate Activity Resources process include Activity Resource Requirements. Activity Resource Requirements are documents that list each activity and the quantity of resources required, their availability, any assumptions made, any constraints discovered, and any dependencies that are found. The Resource Breakdown Structure, also known as the RBS, is similar to the Work Breakdown Structure and is used to identify and clarify the resources that are needed to complete the project. Project document updates to the activity list, activity attributes, and the risk register are based on the outcome of this process. The Estimate Activity Resources process is when the project manager carefully compiles a thorough listing of all the resources that will be needed in completing a project. This process and the estimate cost process that we'll discuss later in the cost management knowledge area are closely related because when resources change, costs change, and those costs will always affect the project baseline. Because of this, a project manager will have to go back and forth between these processes throughout the project lifecycle in order to make any needed adjustments to complete a successful project.